The March 10th anniversary is commemorated every year by Tibetans in and outside of Tibet to pay tribute to the brave men and women of Tibet who have sacrificed their lives for the sake of their country and their people. The year 2008 was no exception. On March 10, Tibetans from the 3 traditional provinces of Tibet, including from the capital Lhasa, participated in demonstrations against the Chinese occupation.
We're getting reports, as yet unconfirmed, that several people have been killed in protests in the Tibetan capital, Lhasa.
Our top story this evening, there's trouble in Tibet.
The demonstrations were a manifestation of deep-seated Tibetan resentment against years of Chinese oppression and were widely covered by the international media. Responding to a question from an American journalist during a press conference on 18th March, organized just after the conclusion of the National People's Congress, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao said, "The recent incident of violence in Tibet was organized, premeditated, masterminded, and incited by the foreign-based Dalai Lama-led so-called Tibetan government in exile. The peaceful demonstration inside Tibet was brutally suppressed by the Chinese government. The Chinese authorities unleashed its full force, including armored personnel carriers, into the streets of Lhasa to crush the Tibetan demonstrations. As a result, Tibetans and Tibetan supporters living in the free world organized various demonstrations and hunger strikes in front of the Chinese embassies, UN buildings, and government offices worldwide. The purpose of these vocal but mostly peaceful campaigns, apart from standing in solidarity with the Tibetans inside Tibet, was to urge the Chinese government to immediately halt its crackdown, release the imprisoned Tibetans, and provide medical treatment to those who were injured in the demonstrations. They also raised slogans pleading for the UN to immediately send an investigation team into Tibet to conduct an urgent independent inquiry into the demonstrations.
It is also important for you all to pray for those Tibetans and Chinese who lost their lives recently."
On 16th March 2008, a press conference attended by more than 100 reporters was organized in Dharamsala, during which His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, "Since the Chinese government continuously accuses me of masterminding the protest, I urge the international community to constitute a committee which will launch an independent inquiry into the demonstrations inside Tibet. This committee can have a Chinese citizen as one of its members, and it should conduct its inquiry not just in the Tibet Autonomous Region, but also in places where Tibetans live outside of Tibet, including the offices of the Central Tibetan Administration based in Dharamsala, India." His Holiness the Dalai Lama also said that a kind of cultural genocide is taking place in Tibet as the Chinese government is putting severe restrictions on the monasteries inside Tibet to stop them from practicing their religion. His Holiness the Dalai Lama further appealed to the international community to launch an urgent inquiry inside Tibet and reiterated his long-standing position that he does not seek independence but genuine autonomy for Tibet. The United Nations Human Rights Commission, Amnesty International, and many other governmental and non-governmental organizations furthermore urged the Chinese government to allow members of the international media and an investigation committee to visit Tibet to determine the truth about the situation inside Tibet. Likewise, the Dharamsala-based Central Tibetan Administration demanded that the Chinese government prove its endlessly repetitive and baseless accusation that the protests inside Tibet were masterminded by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration. It also expressed its hope that since the Chinese government had forced all foreign journalists and tourists out of Tibet, the international community must soon dispatch an investigation team and journalists to enter Tibet to conduct thorough investigations into the events there. The Standing Committee of the so-called Regional Communist Party of the Tibet Autonomous Region convened an urgent meeting in Lhasa on 15 March 2008. After much deliberation, the meeting decided to strike hard against the conspiracies of the anti-China forces without any show of mercy. During this meeting, Tang Jinling, secretary of the Regional Communist Party of the Tibet Autonomous Region, said, "A few separatists have indulged in arson, looting and violence. These are nothing but sheer criminal acts aimed at destroying the institutions of civil society, perpetrated by the conspiracies of a few separatists clamoring for Tibet independence. From the information that we possess, it can be established that these criminal acts were indeed organized and masterminded by the Dalai clique." Thus, the peaceful protests through which Tibetans expressed what they aspire for in their own country were not only regarded as what Tang Jinling called arson, looting and violence aimed at destroying the institutions of civil society, but also something that was masterminded by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration. Tang Jinling also chillingly said, "This is a life and death struggle. Those participating in the protest, those hardcore criminals who are holding the banner of rebellion, raising counter-revolutionary slogans, and are involved in separatist activities, they must be immediately arrested, interrogated, and severely punished in accordance with the law." In short, the meeting decided to brutally suppress the Tibetans participating in the demonstrations without any show of mercy. Xizang Radio even announced that the meeting was attended by deputy heads of the United Front Work Department, Tu Wu Chun, and Sitar, deputy head of the Public Security Bureau, Tang Xinpang, deputy commander of the People's Armed Police, Boi, and other members of the Standing Committee of the Regional CCP. In the evening, Xizang TV showed what it calls original video footages of the 3.14 Lhasa riots. The copies of the video were widely distributed in the international media by the Chinese embassies abroad. The international community and the Chinese citizens in mainland China were told that Tibetans hold deep enmity towards the Chinese people and are attempting to disrupt the Beijing Olympics to be held in August 2008. Every possible effort was made to drive a wedge between the Tibetans and Chinese by erasing the latter's deeply held nationalism. This propaganda drive was a deliberate attempt to manipulate and portray in a poor light the peaceful demonstrations inside Tibet. To justify its brutal crackdown, the Chinese government tried to convert the peaceful demonstrations into what it calls incident of looting, arson, and violence. In a video footage released by the Chinese government, a group of young Tibetans were shown wielding knives and stones. These young Tibetans were indulging in violent acts of hurling stones at passers-by and setting fire to shops and cars. However, it remains in doubt whether these people in the videos indeed were Tibetans, for history has shown that whenever there were peaceful demonstrations in China, the Chinese spies and policemen used to mix up with demonstrators and engage in acts of violence, thus arming the Chinese state with the excuse necessary to deploy its military to crush the demonstrators. This is exactly what lawyer Liu Rongyuan and journalist Tan Wuten and Mo Tenkang accused the Chinese government of indulging in when it released the propaganda videos. An ethnic Chinese woman from Thailand also said that she saw a knife-wielding Chinese policeman in the guise of a Tibetan engaging in violent acts. When the demonstrations broke out in Lhasa on 14 March, she and a group of foreigners sought refuge in the offices of the Public Security Bureau. The woman claimed she saw a group of Tibetan demonstrators and a knife-wielding man being led into the offices of the PSB. She said that as soon as the knife-wielding man entered the office, he changed his Tibetan clothes into the uniform of the PSB. She even said that the man carrying the knife was a Chinese she knew and had come across earlier. Later, when she was deported from Lhasa and reached Delhi, she watched BBC News where she saw the knife-wielding Chinese man disguised as a Tibetan engaging in violent acts. She duly reported this Chinese distortion of facts through the BBC News. The Chinese embassies worldwide passed 2 successive video footages to foreign counterparts. In the second footage, the knife-wielding Chinese man had been removed. Although the Chinese government made every possible effort to distort the peaceful demonstrations inside Tibet as an act of loot, arson and violence, a newly arrived Tibetan woman from Tibet who witnessed the demonstrations in Lhasa said that there is a deep suspicion among Tibetans that one Xiao Tunglen, along with 120 Chinese, had a premeditated plan to stir up violence in Tibet. The Tibetan woman Tsumu said,
"Although I was not aware of it when the demonstrations broke out on 14th March, after March 15 and 16, I heard so many people saying Xiao Julian has an oil refinery near Niantang. The Chinese themselves are suspecting that Xiao Julian, together with his fellow 120 Chinese, did this. They said that there will be less trouble if they steer disturbances before the Olympics, because they would then have the opportunity to arrest and suppress them. The Chinese thus had a premeditated plan."
Kunsang Sonam, who recently arrived from Tibet, also confirmed this as he said,
"Chinese soldiers put on monks' robes. They ran with us and burned down the shops. They simply said they were the ones who set fire to shops. In reality, most of the people were from the 3 provinces of Tibet. It was difficult to differentiate the Chinese from Tibetans. The Chinese have been living in Tibet for so many years, so they look like Tibetan. I think because of grudges they hold in their hearts, they took the opportunity to burn down the shops. That was also what the Chinese said. Some Chinese officials, however, put the blame on Tibetans. They think Tibetans were indulged in looting and smashing. We Tibetans did nothing other than protesting peacefully."
Kunsang Sonam, who recently arrived from Tibet, also confirmed this as he said, "There is so much jealousy and competition between the Chinese businessmen in Tibet. When the demonstration broke out, a group of Chinese took the opportunity to join the peaceful Tibetan protesters. The Chinese then smashed the shops and set them on fire."
There's so much jealousy and competition between the Chinese businessmen in Tibet. When the demonstrations was broke out, a group of Chinese took the opportunity to join the peaceful Tibetan protesters. The Chinese then smashed the shops and set them on fire.
When Radio Free Asia interviewed a group of Chinese businessmen in Tibet, although some of them refused to speak up, there were others who said that the people who were shown on TV looting and burning the shops did not look like the Tibetans they have been living with. They said, "We have never seen them." Likewise, a Chinese woman working in Lhasa said, "Most of the Tibetans are kind. They are not as barbaric as they were shown to be in the video footage. Truly speaking, the Tibetans and Chinese are same. Both are human beings. I'm living in a house rented by a Tibetan. Tibetans treat us really well." When we look back at the peaceful demonstrations that broke out in Tibet, it is clear that they were not what the Chinese government calls riots aimed at destroying the institutions of civil society, but actually a manifestation of deeply suppressed Tibetan resentment against years of intolerable Chinese repression. In particular, the demonstrations occurred because Tibetans couldn't tolerate the massive security crackdown the Chinese government unleashed on the Tibetan monks who were doing nothing but engaging in peaceful protest. As Professor Samdong Rinpoche, the Kalen Trippa of the Central Tibetan Administration, said,
Böchuga Sungi Saku Mambuchik Nanya.
Tibetans in the 3 provinces of Tibet have been subjected to severe repression in the last so many decades, because of which there was an upsurge of protests against the Chinese government.
The Ramameba Dungoya Kapchile Dilia and Shive Namjur Tambala Tsumegi Tratubgi Nyanu Cheche Puri Punda Sirja Genji Pomo Mango Shibuchige.
These peaceful protests were brutally quelled by the Chinese security forces. In the process, Tibetans had to suffer huge losses, as many of them were either killed or severely injured.
If we reflect on the series of peaceful protests that broke out in Tibet, it reminds us of the Chinese proverb that intolerance of minor issues will cause nothing but disruption of major strategies. The Tibetan people rose up against the Chinese because they couldn't tolerate the massive crackdown on the monks who were simply engaged in peaceful protest. In the morning of March 10, 2008, around 300 monks from Drebung Monastery arrived at the Chinese detention center to the west of Lhasa. They were there to urge the Chinese authorities to release some of their fellow monks who were arrested last year for not only protesting against the Chinese occupation, but also for celebrating the awarding of U.S. Congressional Gold Medal to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. As soon as the monks arrived at the detention center, they were kept in custody by the Chinese security forces. More than 20 police and army vehicles and trucks also arrived. The police then arrested some of the protesting monks of Drebung, numbering around 60. Their hands were tied behind their backs. This incident came to the notice of some Tibetans who were on their way to offer prayers at the temples. They urged the Chinese security police to release the monks, but to no avail. A Tibetan lady then protested, urging all Tsampa eaters to rise up against the Chinese. The lady was beaten up and dragged by her hair by the Chinese security forces and forced into a military vehicle. The monks were also severely beaten up and arrested. At around the same time, 9 monks and 2 lay Tibetans protested in front of the Tsuklakang temple and the Pako. These monks and lay Tibetans who were holding the banned Tibetan national flags were soon arrested and beaten up by the Chinese security forces. Tibetan bystanders who witnessed the incident urged the Chinese security forces not to arrest and beat the protesters. The Chinese security forces flatly rejected their appeal and continued beating them. This carelessness from the Chinese side deeply enraged the Tibetan bystanders who made no bones about their anger and joined the protest. This evoked an immediate reaction from the Chinese security police who used tear gas to disperse the crowd. Some of the protesters were arrested and severely beaten up. Regarding this, Lobsang Chedon, who recently arrived from Tibet, had this to say.
2 monks said prayers in front of Buddha Shakyamuni statues in the Tsuklakang temple. They prayed for the long life of His Holiness and Tibetan independence. On hearing this, the Chinese police severely beat the monks. The police then took the monks away from us into a small house. The police thought we would not see the beatings, but we saw everything. A little later, the monks were brought out. Since they were beaten severely, they could not stand on their feet. This deeply enraged the Tibetans, who lost their temperament and, in a show of unity, protested and raised slogans. Uncle and I also joined the protest. The police then hustled the monks into police vans. Suddenly, a Tibetan waved the national flag and shouted out, "Tibet is independent. May His Holiness the Dalai Lama live thousands of years." He was also beaten with electronic batons and taken into the monastery. Around 30 to 40 Chinese vehicles and many policemen arrived. They warned us to go back to our homes or else they said they would shoot us. Hearing this, the crowd dispersed and ran away from the scene. My father and uncle ran up. I didn't see them. I ran down, so they were extremely worried that I was killed. Finally, we were able to see each other.
On that day, protests broke out not only in the capital Lhasa, but also in other Tibetan inhabited areas of Kham and Amdo, despite the massive Chinese security presence. For instance, 200 monks from Konglutsang Monastery, Tsolo Prefecture, Qinghai Province, and 3 monks from the monastery of Tashi Chuting, Bayan Prefecture, protested against the Chinese. Similarly, monks and lay Tibetans of Tashi Lumbu, the traditional seat of the Panchen Lamas, participated in the protest, braving the threat of retribution by Chinese security forces. On 11 March, Tibetan cadres of Lhasa who were on leave were told to cancel their holidays and resume work. They were further ordered not to seek holidays for the time being, to hold firm to their political stance and oppose separatism. Severe restrictions were placed on the school children and students of Tibet University, preventing them from going outside. Despite the ban, 600 monks from Drebung Monastery participated in demonstrations demanding the Chinese release the other monks arrested the day before. The Chinese security forces tried to stop the demonstrations from spreading by firing tear gas into the crowd of protesting monks. Some of them were arrested and confined within their monasteries, cutting them off from food and water and subjecting them to subsequent near starvation. Tibetans living near the monasteries